Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that would rather be dead in a ditch than talk about Brexit again. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
As I told you just before the podcast, I'm very happy because I'm wearing a Pizza John t-shirt and I'm eating pizza because it is Pizzamas.
Yes, you've just informed me of this. I am rapidly Wikipediaing this, and to be honest, I don't think I still fully understand what's going on, but you go ahead. You enjoy. If it involves eating pizza, then it's all good for me.
I will present you with this GIF and leave you to it. But yes, no, I'll put something about Pizzamas in the show notes. Go spend money for Partners in Health because it's a really good charity, and I think you should do that. I seem to spot a blank set of headlines. Does that mean we're going straight into the story again?
There's too much news. What do you expect me to do? There's so much news going on.
There is so much news, everyone.
I've had to, just an idea of me writing the script for this, sorry, it's totally unscripted. I do all of this off the top of my head because I'm incredibly intelligent and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. No, I was doing my research and stuff, so I'm doing my research as they're doing the vote in the Commons. So I'm kind of writing one half of what's happened the week before and one half of what could come. So yeah, there's a lot of news. Apologies for no headlines again, but hopefully we've got a lot to discuss. The main story goes in about 3 different directions again. So yeah, fingers crossed we cover all the main points that we want in this episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's okay. Sorry to our Patreons that this week there's no special news episode because there's too much news again. So the main story. What is our main story, Rob? Is it Brexit again?
It is Brexit again because it had to be, didn't it? Like this was meant to be our last Brexit podcast. Really, it was meant to be over after the 31st. Although not really over because this is just the withdrawal agreement. I read a very good article the other day that they were talking about your views of Brexit in a focus group. And then they told people, they said, this is just the withdrawal bill, that after this we'll have to negotiate with the EU for like probably another 2 to 4 years before we actually properly like leave and stuff, and it's all over for good. And apparently that claim was met by horrified silence. That was in big quote marks from the group. So yeah, not that we would never talk about Brexit again, but it was meant to be the final point, October 31st. We're leaving. Guess what? We kind of haven't. Or we definitely won't now.
Yes, I mean, I think the most telling thing was, I'll find the link for it, but Sajid Javid on TV admitting that we wouldn't be leaving by the 31st of October. And I think as much as Johnson has tried to say, no, we're definitely leaving, we know he's been doing stuff in the background. And I think we've suspected for some time that we weren't actually going to leave on the 31st. So, put down your Brexit Halloween costumes. Instead, you can have, I don't know, what do you do at the end of February? Brexit Valentine's, I suppose. That would be the next thing. That's the nearest holiday. Or a Brexit New Year, I suppose. But let's hold fire until we get round to January. So why am I talking about January, Rob? Or have we got more stuff to talk about first?
Well, I thought we would just briefly go. We can talk about the fact that it has been extended till January, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the deal that's been overlooked. So one of my big frustrations about how the media has handled this certain news cycle since we left you last time. I think last time I was like, nah, it looks like there probably won't be a deal, but we probably won't crash out either. That was kind of my take. And then about the day after we published the podcast, there was like a deal out of nowhere, and it surprised everyone. And then the narrative was all about, will this deal pass? But I think very little of the coverage was about how the deal is different. So I wanted to do a bit of discussion about how the deal that Johnson put forward was different to Theresa May's, how that kind of changed the math in the Commons, and I guess ultimately, given the, what's happened since, does it really matter? Is this deal already dead, or will it pass under a Johnson Parliament? So that was kind of the framing for this episode, I guess, and what I wanted to try and tackle.
Okay, so one thing I wanted to touch on there briefly is that there was, I think it was on the BBC, they did a comparison between the 2 agreements, and talking about your point about the media, one of the things they said was it is 10% different in like text. which I think can be a useful metric in certain types of documents. It shows you how much work has been done, possibly. But I feel like here that kind of is quite different because, I mean, we are going to have a backstop and we are not going to have a backstop are only sentences with one word difference, but the meaning is completely different. So I think really we just have to, I don't think checking that kind of difference is particularly useful because, I mean...
Yeah, it sounds to me like somebody took the two PDFs, copied and pasted them and went kind of like, okay, like did the compare text function you've got in Word and kind of just got a mathematical formula out of it. It seems we're talking about how long MPs want to try and scrutinise this deal. Like, you know, the media has the same time that the MPs have, and they've struggled to get through all. Oh, there was a vast amount of pages that it is. I know it's over 100 pages, so there's a lot of detail to go in. And the fact that 10% has been changed, like you say, is significant, but changing one word can mean an awful lot sometimes, and other occasions it can mean nothing. So,
I suppose the first big talking point was after months and months of the EU saying, well, we can't possibly remove the backstop because Northern Ireland. We had the discussion with Varadkar and Johnson when they came out of it, and it was like, oh, we could make some changes here, which I think we touched on last time. And then suddenly, there's no backstop in the deal. How did Boris manage that, and what did they put in instead?
So they've, instead of having the backstop, which was this, as Brexiteers saw it, a sort of trap for the UK to be kept within the EU indefinitely, the decision here is that Northern Ireland in itself will remain aligned to the EU for at least 4 years, until the end of the transition period. And then after that, Northern Ireland will vote on whether it's comfortable to stay by those arrangements, or if it must be, if they feel comfortable, and this all must be confirmed in a vote in the Northern Ireland Parliament, which is called Stormont. This is like a win for Boris in a few ways. This is a win for Boris in a couple of ways. I think most importantly, when you're comparing it to the May deal, May's deal went on, the withdrawal bill went on until another deal could be decided. So this is the deal 4 years down the line when we actually work out what our working relationship will be with the EU. This is a withdrawal agreement. We're just agreeing to leave. None of those big details about trade agreements have been settled at all. The May deal said that, this withdrawal agreement will stay in place until we have a big one to go with. This Johnson one, basically, instead of a backstop, it's got a front stop of, no, the UK's leaving, like almost like now, October 31st, but Northern Ireland will stay in, and it's Northern Ireland's choice to keep positively affirming that it wants to stay in. So it kind of reduces that trap and puts the power back into the hands of the UK rather than being reliant on the EU for a deal, because I think maybe some of the fears of the Brexiteers was that the EU would dig in its heels, it would dawdle, it wouldn't agree to a deal knowing that they could just keep the UK in there indefinitely. An unlikely scenario, but one that the ERG was certainly taking quite seriously.
So I suppose my question there is, you said Northern Ireland gets to vote on that. The problem we have at the moment is that Stormont isn't sitting. So what would have happened in that situation? Because, I mean, if they're saying they're going to have a chance to vote on it, but we don't currently have, everything is currently suspended over in Northern Ireland, as I understand it, right?
Yeah. Yes, that's right. I think the UK would probably take, the UK government would take strong steps to try and make sure that process comes together, and they would probably say, look, guys, this is a big enough deal for you to at least convene Parliament once to vote on this matter. We'll go into a bit more detail about that consent. We'll go into it now, actually. So, as you said, if there's no Parliament to vote in there, I think that causes a big issue for the whole deal in place. The UK is kind of brushing that to one side for the moment. They believe that things will be settled by then and they'll be able to reconvene the differences enough to vote on Brexit and allow them to go in. The deal mentions a number of scenarios for what happens in terms of a vote on this matter. And if I just go through those, that might give us more of an idea of what will happen. So the ability to stay in the EU stay in line with all the EU laws, and for Northern Ireland to sort of like remain in the EU de facto, would only need to be confirmed by a simple majority, which extends the deal for 4 years. So every 4 years, it would come around and they'd say, are you ready to leave yet, or are you happy staying in? And they do that every 4 years. However, if the vote gained more than 60% support, then they would extend that deal for 8 years. Kind of almost like a 2/3 majority thing, saying like, look, if you're really sure every time, we'll keep bumping it up by long. I think that's in part the EU saying, look, 4 years, although that's quite a long time, it's not that stable for business. 8 years would be even better. If the deal is rejected, then they give a 2-year transition period for the other arrangements to be made. So I imagine that if the two sides weren't able to come together and they weren't able to vote on something, that would kind of trigger a 2-year time period for us to look at how the relationship between the EU and Northern Ireland would be reconvened in that time. Also, if there was that 2-year period, it might give time for the Parliament to get back together and actually vote on the Brexit deal, which the EU might be quite open to. They said, oh, your Parliament wasn't there. Maybe we'll give you another chance to vote. That's very pie in the sky thinking. That's, very...
Very optimistic.
Yes, yeah. Very optimistic. That's very optimistic for what could happen, but that's just a number of the scenarios, and it really does put a lot more power in Northern Ireland's hands when it comes to this new Brexit deal that Boris Johnson has negotiated.
So, obviously, there's some political points going here for Boris, because after the EU's been saying, well, we won't change the backstop, we can't possibly, suddenly it changes at the last minute. And I think that's one of those things they say about negotiations. It's always at the last minute that the compromises are actually made. There can be as much bluster as you like before the final point, but it's like you get to crunch time, you have to make some concessions. How has he kind of played that up in Parliament?
Yeah, I think he certainly said, he's pointed his finger across the aisle and said, you guys thought it couldn't be done. I've done this deal now. Now vote for it. That's kind of been his line. It's seen as more control for Northern Ireland, more devolution. That's another win. It also crucially moves EU issues out of Westminster and into Northern Ireland, which is kind of a better look for England altogether. If you can shift the blame elsewhere or take it out of what's been seen as quite a dysfunctional parliament in the UK at the moment and move it to Northern Ireland, the sad fact is that most people don't pay that much attention to Northern Ireland politics within England. Like, the downside of that is they probably should, and we all probably should. It will probably come to a surprise to many of our listeners that the Northern Ireland Parliament has been shut for the past 2 years. That's something that would probably be national news if it happened in the UK itself or happened in any other assembly. The fact that it's been closed for so long is kind of scary in an area that's had, we've talked about how Northern Ireland is, has quite the political history and the sensitive political history. And as has been mentioned in the chat, it goes to the point that, there's cross-community voting rules, which means that contentious measures require a majority of both unionists and nationalists in order to pass. Something of this magnitude in Brexit, you would imagine, would have to have that cross-party consensus. Boris Johnson has had to go against the DUP and remove that veto process from voting on Brexit matters. I believe that's what I was reading today anyway, and that has grossly upset the DUP, which of course was one of the partners in this, not coalition government, but the
Confidence and Supply.
Thank you. Confidence and Supply agreement that they'd negotiated with the DUP, and that's basically been ruined now because of this new deal. The DUP has strongly said that they are against the way that this deal treats Northern Ireland, the way that it others it in a way and keeps it apart from the rest of the UK, and a lot of other ways we're going to discuss. And of course, Boris Johnson, after he's lost 45, now his majority is under minus 45. He also doesn't have the command of the DUP supporters to try and pass his deal either. So he needs every vote he can get, and he's alienated quite a few people in the process.
I just want to point out one kind of nice upshot of the lack of governance in Stormont at the moment is that purely because they weren't able to stop it, same-sex marriage and abortion is now legal in Northern Ireland, because I think the ruling was if they didn't have a government by October 20th, I may be off by a few days, but it was sometime last week. If they didn't have if their government couldn't vote on that issue, basically they would be forced to line up with the rest of the UK. And so that's been a great thing that's happened. It's kind of weird that you have to actually stop a government working to allow a good progressive thing to happen, but at least there's been some upside, while the rest of it is mostly downside, I imagine. And I'm sure people in Northern Ireland are not happy that their government is not sitting. But hey, sometimes there is a silver lining.
Exactly.
Yeah, so free trade agreements. Everyone keeps talking about how we're going to take back control of our trade by not having free trade. Under May, it was going to be close economic ties with the EU after Brexit, kind of Norway light, or whatever the various kind of ideas people suggested were, Switzerland, etc. So what did Boris manage to get here?
So there were sort of three main things that happened. Boris was given permission by the EU for the UK to negotiate free trade deals while they did their deal with the EU. He's also said that the UK and the EU will aim for a zero tariff deal with no quotas, which is kind of the status quo as it is already, but it's a big bonus that the UK won't be punished by the EU or have high tariffs put on them. And finally, there was a line saying the UK will consider aligning union rules in relevant areas that was in the May deal that's now been removed. So these three things are basically good news for Boris in a couple of ways. We've touched on one before, which is the fact that you're getting the same deal as you did under the EU before, which was already quite a good deal when it came to economic fluidity. That would help Boris's cause by saying this is good for business. Equally, the ability for us to negotiate free trade deals while we're still in negotiations with the EU is a big boon for those, particularly on the far right of the party, whose dream has always been for, the UK should go out and do deals with all these Commonwealth countries, and, we can get a better deal this way rather than being dictated to the EU. That's always been their dream. So by doing that, Boris is sure to get the ERG, the right of his party, on side when it comes to voting for this deal. And lastly, when it comes to good news for Boris on this, is the kind of suggestion that the UK will not align union rules in relevant areas and will scrap them, will again attract the right of his party, the ERG, who's always who's complained about bureaucratic red tape within the EU and wants more control over the way it treats its workers. It's good for the ERG, but as we're about to touch on, it might be seen as very bad news for other people in the country.
Yeah, so with the good comes some bad for Boris. So how are Labour kind of responding to this, and how does that tie into the kind of arguments we've already seen?
So on one side, we've got free trade deals, people saying, yeah, that's great, particularly among the ERG. Labour will say, look, you've already had quite a lot of time whilst negotiating this withdrawal agreement to come up with free trade deals, and you've come up with surprisingly few. We've got barely any. I think we've got some with Switzerland and some with a few African nations, of which I can't remember, but they're very tiny. I think Switzerland is the biggest one.
Was it about 20 we had? But yeah, lots of them are quite small places.
Yeah, exactly. If this has been your record of success so far, what do you think come October 31st to be able to strike up these deals? You might have 4 years to try and negotiate the rest of the Brexit deal, but the UK may see its economic power kind of diminished if you're not part of that big EU bloc. Some people might look on that poorly. So it's certainly a risk, and one that Labour is completely within its rights to point out. Secondly, you've got the point that the lack of workers' rights again plays straight into Labour's claims that this is a Tory Brexit. This is one that will, harm those, particularly those workers who rely on unions for a fair pay, fair wage, good working rights. That's something that the EU was always able to enshrine in law. Anything that, was rejected by the UK courts could go up to the European Court of Rights and say, no, your rights have been, you have been wronged in this certain way, and the UK must change its laws to make sure it protects its workers. That backstop will be gone, and it increases the chance for Labour to say, no, we really don't like this deal. If Boris was, it's quite clear already from these first 2 points where Boris is looking to get most of his support from. He's looking towards the ERG wing and kind of rejecting that notion that many Labour MPs will cross the bench to come support his deal.
So moving on again, I suppose we touched on this a tiny bit earlier. So with Northern Ireland not being in the EU customs union, but part of the UK customs territory, but are still effectively kind of in the EU customs union, right? So that's quite a big... Yeah, I mean, like, it already sounds complicated as I'm describing it. I mean, the difference between customs union and customs territory is going to be hard to convey, maybe. But yeah, so how are customs affected by this? Please make it simple for me, Rob.
I will try my best. So one of the big things Boris wanted to avoid was saying that Northern Ireland was still in the same customs union as the EU. Because if you're in the same customs union, that comes with other prerequisites of maybe you'll have to have some, freedom of movement, that kind of stuff across the board. And one of the 4 freedoms, you would have to enshrine that in Northern Ireland, and that would be bad and be a bit humiliating for Boris, who's always been against that, to go ahead with it. So the way they've got around it is that it will remain legally in the UK custom territory, but will practically abide by EU customs rules just in the Northern Ireland. It's complicated, but it means that any personal goods that go through from Northern Ireland to the UK won't be affected. That'll just be free trade. That'll be the same as it always was. Anything that comes from a third country, so imagine that you're buying a car from the United States and it comes into Northern Ireland. If it comes in once and it's your personal car, then no tariffs are applied to that car, or the same ones that you'd have from US to EU trade, but no additional tariffs will be put on there. If it's commercial, then you'll have additional tariffs put on. Okay? Also, if it comes from a third country into Northern Ireland and then goes on to the UK, and it's not for your personal use but is commercial, then that could be hit by a number of tariffs along the way to try and make sure that the EU gets its share and the UK gets its share. But at the same time, trying to make sure that the people of Northern Ireland don't necessarily lose out. You said, don't make it complicated. I fear that there's no way to make this simple. But I will try. So I've touched a bit on the good news. So in short, the good news is Northern Ireland out of the customs union. Boris saves face, again makes the ERG more likely to vote for the deal. In theory, it could mean that Northern Ireland could benefit from any free trade deals. The UK does, but the EU doesn't do. But that's only as long as those free trade deals kind of abide by some EU rules. They can't contradict each other. The bad news is it's really complicated. If you were saying that, you wanted to do Brexit to remove red tape and confusion, even me trying to do research for this damn thing has got, you're just tied up in a muddle and you say, what are they doing? This is not a simple process at all. Also, it's the duty of the UK, not the EU, to reimburse anyone who's had goods with tariffs slapped on them. And then, it's up to people to challenge what is commercial, what's non-commercial, what's personal use. So with all of that in mind, it creates, I think, quite a lot of potential paperwork for the government to challenge this. So with all of those things going on, I think this is something that looks good for Boris if you don't delve into it too much. I think Boris can have the headline of Northern Ireland is not in the EU's customs union, and for most people that might be good enough, but the devil really is in the detail here, and when you go into the detail you just go, cool, blimey, I'm not too sure about this one.
So yeah, that sounds very complicated. I'm glad. I think maybe I understand it a bit better, but I'm not. Yeah, I mean, all this stuff with customs. I think there's an excellent video that I alluded to in a previous episode, and I might not have actually put the link in the show notes, so I'll go find it now and throw it in. But there's a CGP Grey video about the kind of the triangle of. There's a triangle of 3 different things to do with the border in Northern Ireland, and you can have 2. And this sounds like it's somehow kind of like people have had to accept the idea of the border in the middle of the sea, which it sounded like no one would accept previously, to allow this to happen. And that has just made things quite weird.
Yeah, definitely. Quite weird is a good way to sum up that point.
So yeah, there's a video that will be in the show notes, and it's very good. I would definitely give that a watch. I think it was a good summary of that problem, but it seems like we've got past that somehow by making a bit of a mess of things. So the next topic is cooperation. So we've said, hey, Europe, we're leaving, but we still want to be friends. How's that working out?
The UK has agreed to have a statement that says we've agreed to robust commitments to ensure a level playing field between the EU and the UK. So this suggests cooperations on keeping some of the same regulatory standards as the EU, but in reality this only really applies to Northern Ireland. It's less solid in the rest of the UK. So this is the idea that it would be good news that you would have easier trade if, for example, if you have the same food standard rules as the rest of the EU, then it makes it far easier to trade goods across borders. If you allow a laxer standard of food, or if your food regulations are higher, then, well, not higher is probably better, actually, so it's a bad example, so let me begin again. If your food standards are lower than that of the EU, then you trying to export any of your manky cheese to the rest of the EU, they'll just turn it away because they say, no, this doesn't hold up to our regulations. We're not getting that. The same kind of chlorinated chicken argument you hear from people saying about, chicken from the US into the UK would be something that we may have to accept if we lowered our food standards. This statement kind of suggests that we're not going down the road of this, but also bizarrely, because this robust commitments line has been put in and maybe refers more to Northern Ireland than the UK, this makes the ERG get more on board because it favours the UK a little bit more.
So again, the bad news here, I mean, it seems fairly vague to me. And what are the negatives of this other than it being not the clearest thing in the world?
I mean, the fact that the UK will still have to be equal in some parts may anger the more hardcore Brexiteers. I'm not talking about those in the ERG, who are at the right of the Conservative Party, who, seem to be on board with this deal, but maybe those who, want to vote Brexit Party, those who favour no deal, they probably wanted no links, no regulations that even kept us on the same, anything same to the EU. If you were looking to throw out everything, this is not the deal for you. So it may upset some Brexiteers in that way. And then again, if you're looking at the other side, it's, unlikely to get cross-party support from Labour because some of those protected rights on things like the environment, workers' rights, minimum wage, maternity leave and pay, those type of things, that's what, Labour liked about being with the EU. They liked that backstop for those sorts of regulations. So this certainly suggests that the Boris deal is more right-wing than the Theresa May deal. Therefore, lacking, scuppering any chance he's got of drawing Labour MPs across the bench and towards his deal.
We've had a few pros and cons of the various changes to the deal. And then we've talked about whether it's a bit more right-leaning or left-leaning. How does the public feel? Has it split voters? What's it done?
So I've mostly used a YouGov article for this, so I would whack that in the chat if you could.
I have done so.
So they've compared the vote in sort of 3 different ways. So first of all, they've said, how different do you feel the deals are? In general, about you mentioned that 10% change figure earlier for how much the deals have changed. Only 10% of people feel that there's really a large difference between the deals. And then the majority of people, to me, seem to think that there's moderate to small difference. So 26 for moderate, 28 for small, and 33% basically say they don't know. The amount of people saying that there's no difference at all is quite small. So this suggests that the public are aware there's been a change and at least think that Boris has had some movement on the issue, but the degree of which is up for debate. And most people, I'd say, are in the middle ground about it. What's interesting about this is that there's not much difference between the political parties. I mean, in general, Conservative voters, 37% of them think there's a moderate difference compared to Labour saying there's only 22%. But it's really much a muchness. I think people do agree that this is a different deal to the May deal, and that might all be that might just be the impression that Boris Johnson needs to say that he's made some progress in some way.
I mean, not all change is good. So do people think these changes are substantially better or worse?
Yeah, so on this question, this is where we find out party alignment really matters. So if you're a Conservative voter or if you're a Leave voter, Conservative voters think 55% of them think that the deal is totally better, and 47% of Leave voters agree that the deal is totally better. Compare that amongst Labour and Remain voters. Only 10% of Labour voters think it's better, and only 13% of Remain voters think that it's better. Meanwhile, most Labour and Remain voters, you've got 38% of Labour voters thinking that it's worse, and 36% of Remain voters thinking it's worse. So this deal has certainly split opinion, and I think confirms what we were saying. When we were comparing the good and the bad for Johnson, it's pleased those to the right, but definitely displeased those on the left of the political argument.
And I think as well, there's another question they have, which is, would you prefer Theresa May's deal or this deal? And that is equally split in a very similar way.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a whopping, I think, 76% of Conservatives saying they prefer Johnson's deal, only 4% of Conservatives saying that they would go for Theresa May's deal, and 19% saying they don't know. Compare that to Remain voters, who say 32% prefer May's deal, 18% prefer Boris's, and 50% don't know. I think the don't knows there is, I'm maybe reading into this a bit too much, but I would say amongst the Remain voters, it's almost them saying, no, I'd prefer to stay in the EU as a whole. We've talked about having a second referendum and the possibility of one between a deal and Remain. It's very unlikely that you would, May's deal is dead anyway, so you would never get a referendum where it says, do you want May's deal or Boris's deal? But I think this shows at least, Boris has made significant progress amongst the Conservative wing. And, you saw how poorly the Conservative Party did after, May's deal failed 3 times, and how that was perceived in the general public at the local and the European elections as the Conservatives were sort of weak on Europe. I think at least Boris's deal, when it comes to those within the Conservative Party, he's been able to rally them, and the fact that he's got this much support over his deal, I think, is far more than May was able to gather when she put her deal forward. So it's a more conservative deal, as I've been saying before, but the bullet points for this is it's a more conservative deal, good for Boris and the Conservative Party, but more divisive, and therefore makes it sort of like a far worse deal for those on Labour and the Remain side, and means that they'll probably fight this deal harder than they ever did the May.
So if Labour are fighting hard against this, but it seems to align more with the Conservative viewpoint, and Boris has had some struggle keeping his own party in line, as we know from the previous episodes and previous weeks. If we look at the general population view on what they prefer there, you have nearly half the population does not know whether this deal is better or worse than Theresa May's. You have 37% preferring this deal and 17% preferring Theresa May's. How does that translate to our representatives, our MPs, voting on this in Parliament? What did the Commons do when they were presented with this bill?
Yeah, so one of the first things, what happened was Boris Johnson called a super session of Parliament on Saturday.
Super session.
This was it was quite a symbolic move by Boris. I think in his mind, he wanted to make sure, this was the deal. This was the day that the Brexit deal was done, and everybody confirmed their support for it. It was meant to go through a first reading quite comprehensively, and then Boris could say, look, I called all of you in for a good reason. Parliament's doing everything it can to get this deal done by the 31st, because that's what I've promised, and that's what we'll do. In reality, what happened was that stalled slightly because of something called the Letwin Amendment. So what the Letwin Amendment served to do was to make sure that it was to try and close a loophole in which the government might use to force no deal. So we talked in our previous podcast about the Benn Act, which made the government ask for an extension to January the 31st if there was no deal by October the 31st. What the government could have done is voted on the Boris deal, passed it. Boris then negates the Benn Act, saying, I don't have to send that letter because we've definitely confirmed we want my deal. Oh, whoops, I'm pulling my deal now. Guess what? We'll have to do no deal. And guess what? There's nothing for you to tag this Benn Act onto. It's a bit of a weird loophole, but it does, the government could argue that it could get that through. So what the Letwin Amendment did is it said, no, look, this amendment is tied directly to this Withdrawal Act bill, which makes sure that if this is passed, we're given the necessary time to discuss it, and to make sure that the PM, if this deal wasn't concluded by October 31st, the PM would have to ask for an extension, which made Boris quite upset because it reduced the chances of him getting the deal through by the 31st, and led to him pulling the vote on that deal on that Saturday. We would have votes later on, and on its second reading, it passed by 329 votes to 299. So, bizarrely, out of nowhere, the deal got some support, and I think most oddly, it got support from previous Conservatives who've been thrown out. The big names are Rory Stewart, who's now running for Mayor of London as an independent, Ken Clarke, who's a staunch, Europhile. He's loved the European Union and often, rang its praises in the House of Commons. He said that he will vote for the deal. Philip Hammond, who had been worried that the government was pushing for too much of a no deal, and even Nicholas Soames, grandchild of Winston Churchill, voted for it. It got all the support of the ERG. It also got support from 19 Labour MPs, not the usual 6 that usually defect. So this suggests that out of nowhere, the bill had more cross-party support. It was rejected by most of Labour, all the Lib Dems, all of the SNP, Green, Change UK, and Plaid Cymru.
So this was very much talking about confusing things that have been happening. I was without signal for significant parts of Saturday because I was busy leading a hike along the South Downs, and so every time I went below a hill, I missed out on something important. And there was definitely a point where the Letwin Amendment had passed, and it wasn't yet clear what that exactly meant. Where I was just like, "Oh, well, that sounds good," and then suddenly, everything was all up in the air again, and it was quite a confusing thing to try and explain. People were trying to ask me questions. I was like, I haven't had a chance to read up on half the information here. So, thank you for giving us some clarity on that.
It's all right. I had to read the Letwin statement, explain it to people on Saturday, and then it got completely pushed out of my head again, meaning I had to reread about the Letwin statement before this podcast to remind myself what it meant. But yeah, it's a backstop. That's all you've got to remember. It's a backstop to make sure that we definitely don't leave with a no deal on October 31st.
A backstop which is not to be confused with the backstop, which is Precisely. Now not part of the deal. Yes. Yeah. You can see why this is getting confusing. So essentially this is tying the government's hands, right? And as you say, he pulled the vote. So then he had to send a letter, right, to the EU. That was what was on the cards from the Benn Amendment, right?
So with the Letwin Act, he pulled it on the Saturday, but we still had a vote again the following Monday, Tuesday, I think it was.
Right.
And that passed. But then directly afterwards, we had a vote on the timetabling of the bill. So this was the government trying to get out of the Letwin Act, saying, look, we agree with the Letwin Act, we agree that we'll send this letter if the deal doesn't go through by the 31st. However, we want to force this deal through within 3 days, which is super quick for an act to pass through Parliament, and as many pointed out on the opposition benches, maybe is a little bit too quick for one of the acts that's the most important in our constitutional history ever done. A lot of people were complaining that they hadn't had time to scrutinise the deal in full, and that, if you were to, you wouldn't do this, you wouldn't rush into a purchase of a house like this. You wouldn't.
Yeah, you wouldn't buy a house in 3 days. You wouldn't buy a car in 3 days. You wouldn't. I mean, maybe some people would, but I think most people would not buy these significant purchases in 3 days. And when you're talking about the history, when you're talking about the future of a nation, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. So the government tries and has a vote on, the 3-day timetabling, and that motion loses. And all, most of those Conservative MPs and Labour MPs who had voted for the bill's second reading, they reject this 3-day timetable. So Clark, Stewart, Hammond, the Labour MPs that aren't part of the usual six, etc., go back to the opposition side. So this ties the hands of the government. Basically, it's looking like there's now no possibility that a deal will get done by October 31st. So Boris's final gambit is that he'll threaten to pull the deal entirely, saying, I'll take my ball and I'll go back home. I'm not going to, if you won't vote for my bill within 3 days, then we'll have a no deal, and I won't send that letter. However, he did have to send the letter because of the Benn Act. So in a final Machiavellian stroke, Boris sent the letter as a photocopy and unsigned.
So I mean, that means the letter doesn't exist, right? That's how that works.
I think so, yeah. I don't.
Yeah. So the EU probably saw through that childishness on his part, I'd like to think.
Yes, like there were some rumblings on Brexiteer sides that, the EU might not even agree to an extension. They might have a look at this and, Boris basically saying, I'm sending this letter, but I don't want to give you an extension, might make the EU wonder if they should give one. Like, the EU has always said that, when they gave us the last one, they said, look, don't waste this time. We'll give you a 6-month extension, but you've got to make sure that you can do something productive. This is when I turn to the reader, say, dear reader, they didn't. However, now the EU is getting really fed up, and a lot of members in the EU just want this done. So they're saying, look, we might agree to a 3-month extension, but we've got to know what useful thing you're going to do within that time. And it led to this bizarre waiting game with, the EU, with Labour waiting to see if the EU would grant an extension, because one of the prerequisites for Labour agreeing to a general election, which is what Boris Johnson wants, is that no deal is completely off the table, and the EU looking at Parliament waiting to see if a general election is called, because if a general election is called, then they would definitely approve the extension, because we'd need so many weeks to organise a general election and get ready to try and change the parliamentary math. So they all waited around. I think the other day the EU said, yeah, we've agreed to an extension, but we won't say for how long. And then it came out this morning that they have granted it for January the 31st, which is exactly as the Benn Act said.
3 months, right?
Yes, 3 months from October 31st. Sorry, did I say 6?
No.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
Yeah,
I was just clarifying 3 months. Yep.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, so that's 3 months, and sort of other signs that this has become very official today is that the PM has officially paused the Get Ready for Brexit adverts. So if you've seen them around, if you've heard them on the radio,
or on any of those podcasts that do inserted ads.
Yes. Yeah, precisely. They will disappear. The preparation for Operation Yellowhammer, which was seen as like the no-deal preparations, they've now stopped entirely as well. Even at the production of the much promised 50p coin, which was originally meant to have the date of April on it, was then stopped and said this will be a Brexit 50p coin that says October 31st on it. That has also been paused as well.
Well, it's not just paused, is it? Because they'd already minted a load of them, so they've had to melt them back down. So there's not going to be collector's items, but they will be recycled into whatever the official Brexit date ends up being coins, I imagine.
Yes, but you can imagine the frustration this has caused and the potential attack lines this generates for opposition MPs. A lot of them can now say, most importantly, we used it as a joke at the start of the podcast, but Boris Johnson's "dead in a ditch" comment was one that we all thought at the time stuck in our heads as, you probably shouldn't have said that, and if it doesn't end up happening, you'll look pretty stupid. Spoiler alert, he's looked pretty stupid. People like Mark Francois, I think, the tiny Conservative MP, who I'm sure he'd like to be known for other things, but that's all I can think of when he appears. He said that the reason he voted for Boris Johnson in the leadership election was because he looked him dead in the eye and said, "I will get this country out of the EU by October 31st," and I believed him. So a lot of people playing those sort of clips on Twitter, and again, it makes the PM look weak. You put on, it was, well documented that the Get Ready for Brexit adverts cost about 100 million in total as a campaign. That is money that's essentially being wasted now because people won't have to get ready for Brexit. So, yeah, it's been a costly mistake for the government in both terms of, how it's perceived by the public and financially. And that might play into the up-and-coming general election that may be on our hands, maybe not. We'll have to wait and see.
Well, I mean, on that point, there's been talk of a general election. Boris keeps trying to get a general election, but we have the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which is kind of almost ironic. Well, I feel ironic that a thing the Conservatives put through to kind of consolidate themselves when they were first in power is now coming back to bite a Conservative Prime Minister.
I mean, more hilariously, David Cameron gave us both the EU referendum and the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and then walked away
to this country.
I know, walked away from it all and let it burn. So because of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, we mentioned this before when Boris Johnson won an election, you need a 2/3 majority to win. Previously, I've stated that the Fixed Term Parliament Act was a bit of a joke, really, because why would you ever reject a general election? When it happened in 2017, Labour said, yeah, sure, we're up for it, and voted for it. And any party worth its salt wouldn't say, we're not ready for a general election. What's happened with the current with the opposition parties voting against Boris Johnson is they're saying, one, we want to make sure no deal's off the table. No deal's got to be off the table before we have a general election. We're now maybe getting to a stage where that's a possibility. Now we're in a place of that, where that is a possibility. The government decided to have a vote on it again today to see if they could get a general election date of December the 12th. What happened was that mostly Labour, SNP and DUP MPs abstained. The Lib Dems voted against, and although the government won by 299 votes to 70, it didn't get the 434 it needs to trigger a general election.
So abstaining here is kind of it's just a political choice, really, because I mean, if Labour know that their abstaining is essentially the equivalent of a no vote if they need a 2/3 majority, so it's just kind of them being like, we're not actively voting against it because we do want a general election, but we don't want it right now, which again, mixed messages from Labour as we've discussed.
Yeah, it doesn't. Importantly, it doesn't go on like those "How My MP Voted" websites. It doesn't go on there as they voted against the general election, which would look bad in the future. So and another reason they've been voting against it is everybody's being like, don't give Boris Johnson what he wants. If we keep this, Parliament's idea is if you keep frustrating Boris Johnson, eventually he might, resign or we'll vote down the Queen's speech. Maybe he'll leave by another passage, and if you give him a general election, there is a chance that he could come back with a big majority and then force through any deal he likes. Because the one thing that is stopping Boris Johnson is the mathematics in Parliament. That's why he wants a general election so much, really, to try and shake that up. However, we now have a potential alliance between the Lib Dems and the SNP to put a motion forward to make sure a general election is held on December the 9th.
So I saw you explaining this brilliantly to one of our friends earlier who asked the very pertinent question, why would you put a motion forward to move the general election date 3 days earlier? I mean, there must be some cunning reason behind that.
So the cunning plan, and it's as cunning if you put a tail on a fox and call it a weasel, or whatever the Blackadder line is.
Sorry, as cunning as a fox who has recently become Professor of Cunning at Cunning University.
Thank you. I'm always up for a good Blackadder quote. Yes, the cunning plan is that if you move it to December the 9th, then it doesn't give time for Boris Johnson to get his deal through Parliament. Any general election that happens means that you have to prorogue Parliament. There's that word again, for those of you who are paying attention at home. You'd have to shut down Parliament for 5 weeks in order for a general election campaign to happen. So if you want a general election on December the 9th, then you have to close Parliament by next Monday. That does not give the government enough time to get its bill through the House of Commons, and it even makes it a little bit tricky for the government to get a crucial budget deal through for Northern Ireland, which they need to do because there's no Parliament in Northern Ireland, as we've discussed, so the UK has to put together some money for then. If they don't put a budget forward, then that would be very bad. It would certainly affect like the Conservative standing and how they could run the country. So the Conservatives have to kind of prioritise that, and we've already had news from Boris Johnson tonight saying that he will not bring his withdrawal agreement back for Parliament for it to be voted on. So that's already making some moves that Boris is willing to hear this concession from the Lib Dems and the SNP. So the other question you may have, we've had a 2/3 vote and it keeps getting rejected. Even if all the Conservatives, the SNP and Lib Dems voted on it, it still wouldn't be 2/3. So how do you get an election thing through Parliament? The answer to that is essentially you write a one-line bill that says, we agree with the Fixed Term Parliament Act, apart from this time, where we'd like a general election, please, on this date.
Which we discussed, I think we discussed previously was an option, but we didn't put too much weight to it, I think.
No, now that the other parties are coming forward and it gives Boris Johnson the hope of some sort of like a simple majority rather than a 2/3 majority, it becomes a plausible way to get a general election in December. So that's what it would be. That's what would be put forward. It would be put forward by the Lib Dems and the SNP, we believe, and then it'll be voted on, and most likely, how it will be voted on by the parties will be interesting to see. Labour, up to this point, has been able to get away with abstaining because all the other parties are against it. The opposition has been fairly united in denying the Conservatives a general election. If Labour were the only opposition party to deny them and they lost the vote, I wouldn't want to go into a general election as the party that didn't want this election to happen. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a bad look for Labour by saying the SNP and Lib Dems saying, well, we were up for it and we voted for it, but all of your Labour MPs actively voted against it. It's not a good scene, and that's why Jeremy Corbyn has not outright said that he won't vote for any motion tomorrow, but he wants repeated assurances that no deal is definitely off the table before he agrees to any form of general election in December.
So, what would you rate our chances of a general election before Christmas then?
So yeah, in conclusion, I think they're quite high if Boris Johnson keeps his promises, which is like
yes,
yeah, which is a huge thing to say. It's bizarre, it's a line that's often used against PMs, I guess. Like they would say that one is untrustworthy or he can't be doing it, but when it comes to Boris Johnson, the things he's already done, it's quite clear, it's quite openly said in Parliament that you can't trust Boris Johnson to do what he says he's going to do. He often says he'll do one thing, comes up and does something absolutely different. So if Boris keeps his word, says, no, we're not going to debate the withdrawal bill, and is able to make the concession of the 9th of December election, I think it's very likely. I know that Jo Swinson has already been on Channel 4 News tonight saying that she would wait and see what the deal Boris would give before making a decision. So you probably won't hear anything until tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning, which will be probably after this episode has gone out, hopefully.
Yes. Yeah, fingers crossed. It's a hell of a time to be trying to record a podcast where you've had one general election rejected. You can't lead with general election rejected, because I think it's a very big possibility that they will have one on December 9th, which would be the first December election since Stanley Baldwin in the 1920s.
That is some good political knowledge there. That's why we have you on here, Rob. I could not have pulled out that fact. So.
And December elections cause all types of problems. I don't know if you've heard like the major concern for primary schools up and down the country about a December election.
Is it because that's when they have? So the primary schools have to have. So primary schools get used as polling stations, and is it therefore it affects something like SATs or something?
No, something even more precious than SATs. Nativity plays.
Nativity plays.
Nativity plays. Yeah.
How about mince pies? Like you know how they have the sausage sizzle in Australia. Mm-hmm. Well, I think we should have mandatory mince pies. Well, I mean, not mandatory. I mean, if you're vegan, you might not eat them, for example. But I mean, not force people to eat them, but like have mince pies available at all polling stations. I mean, I'm sure that is a worthy use of the government's money they need to run an election.
Yeah, exactly. They should do something, and like there was having an election in December. Most people, there's a general theory that who can be bothered with an election and Christmas? Like, I'm preparing for Christmas already. Who wants to bother with that? I saw a good tweet earlier, which was about a by-election they had in Clyde a few years ago. I can't find it now, but essentially they posted a picture of Labour MPs posting with some people dressed up as Father Christmas by-election, and it just looks really tacky. So I'd like to avoid any of those sort of political campaign messages around December 12th. There's also genuine concern about voter turnout from Labour. Labour kind of saying that, we've talked before about how bad weather can reduce turnout, particularly amongst those who, are generally poorer, can't get out as much, it reduces most of the elderly as well. Labour thinks a December election would be bad for them in that way. Also, there's not enough time to get sort of like students are moving around about that time. It's the end of term. Some might be coming home. Others might still be at university. That flexible voting, which constituency they vote in, really could affect how you campaign in a general election. And finally, even like one of the concerns, or one of the demands of the Lib Dems and the SNP might be that you give votes to 16-year-olds. That might be one of the things that they try and tag on to a general election bill, saying, yes, we'll agree to a general election as long as 16-year-olds are finally enfranchised. That would be great, and I think, personally, I think 16-year-olds should definitely have the vote. But from a practical point of view, trying to add a significant part of the population onto the electoral register when nobody's even, if you're 16 now, you wouldn't even considered trying to register for a vote in December, never mind it suddenly being given to you and only having 5 weeks to do it. It raises an awful lot of questions. So there's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of things that could go wrong, and a December election is certainly maybe not the optimum month for one. But this Parliament has not been one for doing anything optimally. So I feel it's probably fairly likely that we will have a general election called tomorrow if Johnson keeps his promise.
Okay. So on that note, I just want to say, and I imagine our listeners, I'm preaching to the choir here probably, but if you're not registered to vote, say you've just moved house or you're a student and you're not sure where you're registered, now is the time. Register to vote. Make sure you're registered wherever it is you live. It doesn't take long normally. It's an online form these days. It's a bit more faff if you want to do a postal vote, but it's pretty easy. Go and do it now. That would be my recommendation. And sometimes you need to double check they haven't taken you off the electoral roll for some silly reason as well, because I've seen, I think they send a thing around every year where you have to just kind of say, yes, I'm still here, but it's not, you might have forgotten to do that for some reason. So if you have any concerns, you can just ring up your local council and ask, am I on the electoral roll? And if not, apply. And I suppose on that point, we need to go into our quick polls update and see what we can glean from the polls. So, as always, we're going to our favourite website, Britain Elects. And, well, I don't think it's necessarily surprising here. If you look at... I will get the picture up in a second. If you look at the poll numbers, it looks like the Conservatives have got this massive lead over Labour. I mean, Labour's been very flat. The Lib Dems have dropped a little bit, the Greens have dropped a little bit. But the big thing is, since we last talked, the Brexit Party has dropped by a significant amount, about 2%. And that seems to mostly be going to the Conservatives. And similarly, the Lib Dems have dropped, and you're seeing that go towards Labour again. So the tying of these parties together is kind of following the lines we normally see. But it is, I mean, the Conservatives are currently ahead by 10% in the polls, which is quite a lead.
Yeah, you can see why Johnson is calling for an election. It's the best they've been in a long while. They're edging up to figures that they were only at, let me try and get, in 7th of April 2019 was the last time they were at 35%. And that was kind of the beginning of their dip. Before then, in 8th of March 2019, they were on about 40% above Labour. Now, the thing is that both the Conservatives and Labour Party experienced quite a significant trail-off in form, particularly after the Brexit deal failed to go through. The difference between the two parties is that the Conservatives have been able to recover far more than Labour has, and that's mostly due in part to the remarkable resilience of the Lib Dems to keep up their numbers for such a long time. They're dipping now in comparison to the Brexit Party, which really experienced that peak at the European elections, but as time rolls on and they're not considered I don't think they're considered a parliamentary party. They're always considered like a protest vote. They're fading away, and it's been kind of, Alistair Campbell even mentioned it when he was in a recent interview with Andrew Neil on the BBC Politics show. He said that we haven't seen enough of Nigel Farage recently, which is an odd thing to say. But Nigel Farage has really spoken out against Boris Johnson's deal, and you'd think if that were given more coverage that he'd be taking votes, more votes away from Johnson, who maybe some people had pinned their colours to the mast and said Johnson's a no dealer. He's the one who's gonna, get us out come hell or high water. Now he's come forward with this deal. Some hardcore Brexiteers, that might force them away from the Conservative Party, but no, the Brexit Party's taken a real back seat. Nigel Farage has taken a real back seat when it comes to like the media agenda and the established papers. I always think of like the Mail and the Express have really got behind Boris Johnson and haven't even been, flirting with Farage like they normally do. So I think that's another reason why the Conservatives have been able to keep that lead up significantly. It's a risky time for the parties to call a general election. That might be it's been the Conservative line that Labour have been scared to have a general election. I think that's unfair. I think Labour have genuinely been worried about no deal, and the possibility that Johnson might, suddenly pull the trigger or pull a fast one to get us out to make sure that he could uphold his promise. It's only now that no deal planning has stopped, that he's pulled the adverts, that I now think he's realised that, we're not going to leave the European by October 31st, and how the polls change after that. If it leaves Johnson with egg on his face, if the Conservatives aren't able to recover that, then we could see Labour's numbers go up quite a lot. A lot can happen over a 5-week election campaign if one goes ahead.
I mean, as we know from the last general election, having a massive lead for the Conservatives doesn't necessarily mean they'll win, although I definitely feel there's not the same level of momentum behind Corbyn as there was last time. I think we've talked about this several times, with the fact that the view of him in the media, the way he, now that he has become an established opposition leader, I think he's the more people know about someone, the less likely they are to go, oh, well, there'll be a force, like an inherent force for change. So I think there has been a drop off there. in that kind of groundswell of support that Labour had last time of kind of like, oh, we'll change, we'll go with Corbyn. I still think there's a lot of grassroots people out there who probably would vote for him, but as you say, it's student populations, etc., who may be negatively affected by a December vote. We don't know. This is all speculation at this point, but yeah, I mean, I think it's a slightly concerning set of polls for me still at this point, because I feel, especially with the kind of deselection that may happen for some of the more traditional Conservatives like Ken Clarke that we've seen, that would be, I think there's a chance that we'll have a more right Conservative Party out of this that then wins the election, which is not something I'm personally a fan of.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it could lead to a more radical parliament, a parliament with with lots more newer MPs than before coming in. And once you lose that sort of stability, the Fixed Term Parliament Act was put in place and it was meant to enforce stability over 5 years, that you had this continuity. We certainly haven't got this now and having elections so often that we do. And if it brings, a Johnson government in on what would be quite a right-wing and populist agenda, that I think that is, slightly worrying. But as I've said before, 5 weeks, long time in politics. A lot of things can change in that time. It had a 20-point lead last time and they threw it away. So, it remains to be seen what will happen over December. And crucially, if we do get a general election, it'll give us a general election to talk about and not Brexit. Yeah,
which I think would be a nice change for the country as well as for this podcast, yes.
Well, yeah, and it's a good change for that plays into Labour's hands a lot. Labour's message in the last election, they won a lot by saying, look, we're not really going to talk about Brexit. Here's our social policies. Do you like them? And 40% of the country came back and said, hell yeah, we do. If they can change the conversation and say this election isn't about Brexit, but on how you are, governed in all the other areas of your life. Aren't you fed up of austerity? Aren't you fed up of this? That's where we could see the real rise for Labour in the polls in the next 5 weeks.
Okay, so general election then, watch this space. And I suppose that leads us into our wrapping up and our outro this week. So as always, thank you to all our guests who've joined us in the chat and listened along while we've been talking. You can find a link to our Discord in the show notes and come and find us here and listen along as we record these episodes, and also give your opinions in the chat. It's always good to have some discussion, and also correct us on things we get wrong. As I always say, if you really enjoyed this podcast, the best thing for helping people find out about podcasts is word of mouth. We literally had 2 new people join the Discord server as we started recording because I saw some word of mouth happening on another Discord server, so that's really good. But yeah, word of mouth is the best way for people to find new podcasts. So if you really do like this, recommend it to a friend, and hopefully they'll listen to us. If you want to point people to where we are, if you want to come, you can come to parliamentary.observer, our website, and chat along there in the comments. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language, and you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at unparlpodcast. There should be more little clips and videos going up on the Instagram now because I've got like an automated service like generating little clips for us. I do have to kind of pick through them and decide which ones actually make sense. Sometimes they cut you off mid-sentence, but it is helping us generate some little videos, which is good. There's also a YouTube channel where you can find all of our videos as well, our shows as videos as well. And finally, if you want to support this podcast and everything we do at TTSS Productions, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS. And so I suppose it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Bye. Sorry, I know you're mid pizza.
No, this is a complete aside for the listeners. I have now finished my pizza.
Hooray.